God, I know I'm doing terrible with holding the camera and framing myself very well, but I'm very focused on what I'm saying. So we also took a trip to Fez and Chef Shaolin. That one was really funny because Harim asked me and Jonathan, would you guys like to go on a trip with two French girls to Fez and Chef Shaolin? And I said, two French girls? Let me think. Yeah, I think we would. So we went. I had no such luck with the French girls, but we still had a lot of fun, even though Fez, John and I found quite a contempt for Fez. The Medina was absolutely impossible to navigate. According to some sources, this is not on accident, but it's actually on purpose. This was meant to be a defense against foreign invaders. And I heard from one local tour guide, the Medina has over 9,000 streets. It seems like a lot, but I somehow don't find it that hard to believe. Unfortunately, because of incomplete map data and GPS drift, Google Maps was not very reliable for getting to where you want to go. As you might expect, in the world, the place that is most difficult to navigate by tourists has the greatest number of tour guides. You are swarmed by tour guides. And Harim gave us very good forewarning about these tour guides. They're tourist traps. They're not honest. They don't come up and say, hey, do you need a tour guide? They say, oh, hi, friend, visiting, where are you from? USA, yeah, where are you trying to get to? And, you talk to them, you're just having a conversation. They ask the question and you answer, because it's not super secret knowledge where I'm trying to get to. And then they say, oh, yeah, it's right over here. And then they start to take you. And then, of course, they drop it on you that they're a tour guide and they're actually expecting you to pay them. So forewarned is forearmed, and I was very, very aggressive at keeping these tour guides off, although we did end up getting help from one or two at some point in time, but these were people who I told very upfront that we had no money to give them. I guess this was just one time. We told them upfront that we had no money to give them, and they were still very kind and showed us the way. So that was good on that person. Very thankful for them. So we saw Fez, and then we went to Chef Shaolin. Chef Shaolin was very, very beautiful. Chef Shaolin is called the Blue City because everything's painted blue. As best I can tell, the reason that the city's painted blue is because they were all ordered one day to paint it blue to attract tourists, which is kind of cheap. The city itself is absolutely beautiful. I mean, it's in the mountains. The name Chef Shaolin, I believe, is actually Amazi, for look between the two peaks, is what the name means. So you're just surrounded by these beautiful mountains, blue sky, and a Medina that is nowhere nearly as hard to navigate as Fez, nowhere nearly as claustrophobic. That's the other thing about Fez. The streets are very, very narrow and fairly dirty, to be frank. So the open spaces of Chef Shaolin were much more enjoyable. Yeah, it was just a nice, beautiful nature place. So there we went. We had another trip not too long after that to the desert, vaguely referred to. I guess you could call it the Western Sahara. I don't actually know exactly where in the Western Sahara we were, but we took this trip. So the trip consisted of us taking a one-day trip to Marrakesh. I got to see that town a little bit. I got to take some footage in the famous square of Marrakesh. We were picked up by a tour group that took us with them, and we were actually all very, very unhappy with the tour group. For one, none of us had any itinerary whatsoever, so we had no idea really what the plan was, and we found out as we went along that it was basically 3 days of almost continuous driving. They kept trying to take us to these very expensive restaurants, and by expensive I don't mean fancy, I mean overpriced for Morocco. They're ripping us off, really. So these tours have commissions with these restaurants to bring in tourists. So we tried, the first time we just kind of fell for it, and then the second time we tried to find somewhere else, but we couldn't, and then the third time we did actually find a little fast food place not too far from there where we could get a more reasonable price. So, Moroccan fast food. I love Moroccan fast food, man. Everywhere you go in Morocco, the fast food places are basically the same. They basically have the same menu of sandwiches or paninis, which are not what we would call paninis, but more like panini pressed tacos or something like that. And they have these tacos too, which again are fairly different from what we would typically think of as tacos, but you know, they have different forms of you know, your carb, your bread or whatever, with different forms of meat, tuna, chicken, turkey, these meatballs called kefta, minced meat, etc. You usually can just get a sandwich and fries for about $3. Kind of a fast food paradise, I would say. Actually, it was really nice to be able to get pretty consistent and good fast food from basically anywhere you went. So this, anyway, back to the topic at hand, the desert trip. 3 days of very, very long driving for most of the day, stopping in hostels. The hostels themselves were actually not too bad as far as accommodations. They were fairly cheap. So we met some more people besides the group that we were traveling with on the tour and inside the bus. I call it a bus, but it's really more like a souped up van that's meant to hold about 10 people. So we met some people besides our group, and we drove for 3 days. We had some touristy stops on the way. That's where I learned a little bit more about the Amazigh people. We visited a place that was famous as a movie set in Star Wars and Game of Thrones and a couple of other things, the Scorpion King or something, or Indiana Jones. I don't remember all the films, but a lot of them. They try to sell you a bunch of overpriced things along the way too.
Now it's Fatima from Finland, the Queen of Sahara. Okay, for the wind it's better like that with some glasses.
When we actually got to the desert, we were all pretty disappointed with that as well. We got there just a little bit before sunset. You ride the camels. These are one hump camels, dromedary. You ride them for about 80 minutes from where you arrive. You basically arrive to the edge of the sand. You get on the dromedary. You ride it for about 80 minutes, which if you've never ridden an animal is actually very, very tough because your abductors are involuntarily flexing to keep you mounted to the animal. You're basically hugging it with your legs for dear life, which gets very, very tiring. I don't want to say for dear life, that's an exaggeration, but it is a persistent and involuntary muscular reaction that by the time you get off the camels, you're just like, oh, I really need to stretch that out. And then you're thinking, oh, we gotta do this again tomorrow morning. I'm not looking forward to that. But it wasn't so bad. The muscle fatigue was not so bad. So the desert was the desert. It actually was pretty cold. You know, the desert gets cold at night. Our conditions, unfortunately, were also very windy. We came in this sort of sandstorm almost. It was dark by the time we got there. Our accommodations were pathetic. I'll speak very candidly about that. The beds were rock hard. Been forgiven for mistaking them for being made out of clay. Very, very little bounce, very little give, so you don't really sink into them. We had like one blanket, like one very light blanket per bed, which was nowhere nearly adequate for the conditions that we slept in that night. And we were told that we would have to wake up at 5 a.m. and the breakfast would be at 5:30. Then we'd be leaving at 6, something like that. If I recall correctly, I woke up at 5 a.m. because I'm a good boy. I always do as I'm told. At 5:15, I walked into the tent, the one communal tent where we'd been served dinner the night before and where we were expecting to find breakfast. And I found the group of workers sleeping still. So they told us to wake up at 5 and they were asleep at 5:15. Okay. So, well, I had turned on the light in there, so I'd already kind of woken them up. Sorry, not sorry. I got ready. Breakfast was served fairly late. Nobody was happy about waking up that early, but we did figure out that it was pretty necessary because it was about, but by the time we rode back on the camels, which they tried to sell us the sunrise, more or less, they tried to sell you up to the opportunity to ride a dune buggy to the top of a dune and watch the sunrise, or you could just see it rise from behind you as you're riding on your camel. Most of us were not keen on that option, so we just rode our camels back, 80 minutes, got back in the van, drove all day to get back. So there's a lot of boring details, but basically we drove a lot and slept in really unfavorable conditions to ride on the camels. Oh, and the camels, God, man, the conditions, these camels were not happy. I mean, they're tied in caravans of 10 or 12, I think, and they're almost ass to mouth with how close they are to each other. They don't have any, I mean, and I get it in a way, because obviously tying them in a caravan is the easiest way to manage a group of 10 or 12 camels at a time. But come on, if I'd known, oh, and a lot of the camels were really not keen on bending their knees and taking passengers, and they expressed their discontent very, very vocally. So these camels were not happy camels, and I was not happy about that, because I feel like if I had known about the conditions these animals were going to be in, I would have had second thoughts about going on that particular trip. But hey, what can I say? I mean, I did get to ride camels in the Sahara Desert for less than $100. You could argue that I got what I paid for. I don't know. So the one day of driving back to Marrakesh, we arrived, and Jonathan actually started getting pretty sick at this point. The group of us, there was 6 of us, Jonathan, myself, and 4 others. This is just from, as far as volunteers from the British Language Academy goes. There was 4 of us, 6 of us. We got a nice little Airbnb there, split the cost, and chilled out. We were actually very, very happy with the conditions in our Airbnb after that shit show of a trip that we'd just been on. So we were all chilling in the Airbnb. Jonathan was riding out his sickness there for a little bit. Finally started getting better, and so we returned to the British Language Academy. And that was the last trip we took. I mentioned in my New Year's video that I had this small bug and that it wasn't too bad. It got better and then it got worse, and I suddenly had a very strong fever and fatigue out of nowhere. Was not expecting that, because when your symptoms start to get better, you think you're gonna get better, that you're over it, but it wasn't the case for me. So I spent about 2 days, I think, fairly sick and bed resting, and then a few more days after that, less sick but still inclined to bed rest. Well, we were getting pretty tired of the volunteering. It was good fun, but some of the conversations were more fun than others. Talking to beginners over and over again got pretty old pretty fast, because you're not really having a conversation. You're reciting these scripts about how are you, where are you from, tell me about your family, and you're not even really very free in your ability to express yourself. So even if you wanted to have a conversation, they wouldn't understand a lot. So the beginner conversations got pretty tedious. We kind of felt like we were getting tired of Morocco in general and the British Language Academy in general. It was just time to move on. So we booked our flight here to Tunis, and we continued to heal from our sickness, and then we said goodbye to everyone and left. And here we are in Tunis. And we've been in 2 Airbnbs in Tunis so far. We've seen a little bit of different parts of the city. We're staying currently in the Medina. And that brings you all finally up to speed in what is probably my longest video ever. That's what happens when you delay giving us a essential update for 6 weeks, roughly. That's it for now. Like I said, we're in Tunis. I think the next update that I give will be pretty surprising to some of you if you don't already know. But until then, take care.